standing, if you would, turn your Bibles to Job chapter 1. I'm so used to, when I say that, saying, when you find your place to get stand, but you already are. So find your place in Job chapter 1 and don't sit yet. Job chapter 1, I'm going to start reading in verse 6. I'll give you just a moment more to find your place. Job chapter 1, verse 6, it says, Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? And Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. Let's go ahead and we'll stop there and let's have a word of prayer. Lord, again, I want to thank you for this night, this opportunity we have to open your word tonight, Lord. I pray that you will bless this time, Lord. I pray that you will speak through me, Lord, and just help this message to be what we need to hear, Lord. I believe, as I always do, I believe that this is the message you've given me for this evening, Lord, and it's what we need, and I pray that you help us to be open and receptive to it, Lord. I pray this in your name. Amen. You can go ahead and be seated. The book of Job is one that to us as Christians is the opposite of what we like to think Christianity is. It really, for us, very often, the book of Job is really a hard book for us to wrap our brains around. Because it's the opposite of what we think and what we want Christianity to be. We're not in the sort of church that is, the health, wealth, and prosperity type of church, but every Christian wishes that that's how it was. Because though it isn't biblical, we all kind of like the idea that if I obey God, I'll always be healthy. We all kind of like the idea that if I follow God's will for my life, then I'll always have plenty of money. We all kind of like the idea that if I'm where God wants me, I'm always going to prosper in everything that I do. If I obey God, then everything will go my way, and doors will open for me, and I'll be wealthy, and everything will be great, except then we come across the book of Job. And it goes completely against all of that thought. You read the book of Job, the Bible doesn't say this came because Job sinned. That is how we like to justify things like this. This is being faced because of some wrongdoing. The Bible doesn't say this is because Job sinned. In fact, nowhere in the book of Job do we even see that hinted at. This didn't happen because God was punishing Job. In fact, quite the opposite. Yeah. Job was living right and doing exactly as he should, and yet Satan comes to God and God points him to Job. This is a man that's going to do right no matter what. And as we just read, God allows Satan access to attack Job, and we know what happens from here. I'm not going to have us read tons and tons of it, but in a matter of what appears to be moments, Job loses his livestock, he loses his children, he loses his servants, he loses houses, and while maybe not physically, he lost his wife and friends. Job is going through a time where we could very easily, and for himself, would have been extremely easy to look at and say, where is God in all this? Or even, why has God abandoned me? Think about this from Job's side. I think we often forget as we read a book as a whole, we don't take into account what they were thinking in the moment of it. Can you imagine for Job what must have been going through his mind of, I'm doing everything right. I'm serving God. I'm living how I ought to. Why? And I don't think any of us could fault a person to go through what he did and say, why did God abandon me? What I want us to notice as we go through this, because I think that would be the natural thought for every one of us, what I want us to notice as we go through this is, in all of it, God hadn't left him. In all of it, God hadn't left him. My title for tonight's message is God in the Worst of Days, which is what Job is having. We'll sometimes have what we consider a bad day, and in those days we'll often use a phrase like, can this day get any worse? Which always seems like a really bad thing to say, because yes, it always can get worse. But I would guess that everyone in here has had a day they think couldn't get worse, but none of their days that you thought could... Boy, that didn't come out how I thought it did. Hold on, let me reprocess that. We've all had days that we think this day couldn't get worse, and none of our worst days can compare to the day Job just had. Yeah. We all have those days that we think are, boy, this day couldn't get any worse for whatever reason. It may be a string of bad things that happened, or something went wrong at your job, or a fight at home, or a problem at work, or school, or whatever it may be. But a day that you thought was the worst ever, and you felt like you were all alone, because somehow that's what happens. When we go through those bad days or those problems, we think, I'm all alone, and nobody has problems as bad as mine. We get the mentality when we go through something bad that this is worse than anyone has ever dealt with before. No one understands my pain because no one has dealt with this problem before. Which, I'll just say this now, isn't true. People have faced what you are. We just tend to be so stuck on ourselves in those times that we refuse to acknowledge other people have problems. We get this, no one is there for me attitude. But again, I'm just going to take a step of faith here and say that no one in here's bad day quite lives up to Job's bad day. I've had some days that I thought were tough days. None of them compared. None of us have lost everything possible in one day. Again, he literally lost everything except his health in that one day, and that was shortly to follow. None of our bad days come close to that, and yet through it, dealing with all of that, God was there, and God was involved, and God was orchestrating it. Yeah. Through all of it. I want to start by pointing this out. If God was there for this day in Job's life, don't you think he's there for your bad day, your worst day? This evening, I have four things that I want us to see God in this worst of days for Job. The first thing I want us to notice is God knew Job. We just read it in chapter 1, 6 through 8 again. It says, Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Now, Satan's come to God, and all this started. God didn't have to think about who can I point out to Satan. There was no pause to think, who can Satan tempt? He immediately knew Job, which tells you a few things. It tells you that he knew him by name. We see that immediately. It's, Hast thou considered my servant Job? There was a personal relationship between God and Job. This isn't, just some guy over there in the distance who God said, here, you need to attack somebody, that guy. No, that he knew Job. There was a relationship there. We see as we get into the book the conversations that go on between God and Job. That wasn't a new thing. They had a previous relationship. It tells me that God knew not only his name, that God knew what kind of man Job was. He knew that there was none like Job in the earth. You think about that statement that God makes to Satan there. Verse 8, hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. This is God saying this about Job. You think about that statement, that's quite the statement to be made by God himself. But then add to it this idea of there's none like Job in the earth. Job lived in a time where he would not have been considered the only godly man alive. It wasn't like in the times of Noah, when Noah and his family were the only ones that were still serving God. For the time of Noah, it would have been easy to say, Noah, there's none like him that lives on the earth, because there wasn't. Everyone else was a mess. For someone like that, it would have been easy. That wasn't necessarily the case with Job. Narrowing down exactly when Job lived is, it's not like the Bible says Job lived from this year to this year. So narrowing it down, isn't an exact science, but based off of some hints we see in the book and some, I always am hesitant to call them scholars, self-proclaimed scholars, we figure Job lived somewhere between the years of Noah and Moses. Now, think about that time frame. In that time frame between Noah and Moses, you also have men like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. All men that could be said were godly men. The Bible still says, God still says, there's no one like Job on the earth. That's quite a statement. That's quite a statement. God knew what kind of man he was. He knew that Job, as he put it, was a perfect and upright man. He knew that Job feared him. He knew that Job eschewed evil, which simply means he hated evil. God knew what kind of man he was. It also tells us that God knew what kind of reaction that Job would give. He knew how he would respond to the attacks. He knew what his response, what his reaction would be. Growing up, my brother got picked on a lot, and for good reason. He reacted. People who like to pick on other people do it for the reaction. They do it for the response. You're gonna, they want you to get mad or upset or some sort of reaction. If you don't get a reaction, they get bored and leave you alone. As a kid, I figured that out. I wouldn't give a reaction that they wanted, and people would leave me alone. And Bo, I think, knew that. He knew that they only picked on him because he reacted. If he didn't, I told him that constantly. But I guess he couldn't help himself, so he reacted, and they kept kicking. But the reason was, it was known he would react. That's what we have here. God knew what the reaction of Job would be. He knew that it wasn't going to be Satan attacked and Job got angry. Satan attacked and Job lost his cool and said and did a bunch of things that he shouldn't. He knew what Job's reaction would be. Which tells you that God had been paying attention to Job. The only way that you'll know someone by name and know what kind of person they are and know how they're going to react to as terrible things as this, you have to be pretty familiar with that person. You don't learn those things in casual conversation. You don't figure those things out in passing. God knew him. Isn't it a comforting thought to know that God knows you? Well, either comforting or very convicting. God knows my name. God knows what kind of of man I am. God knows my personality. God knows what I do and don't like. He knows how I'll react and respond to things. He knows me, which is either really good or really bad, depending on what he knows about you. Because God knows how I'll respond. When I have a trial upcoming, God already knows how he'll react. He knows me. Second thing that I want us to notice is God was protecting through all of this. Look at verse 12 with me again. It says, "And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord." Skip down only at chapter 2 and verse 6. Chapter 2, verse 6, it says, "And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, he is in thy hand, but save his life." God didn't say, "Satan, did you consider Job?" and leave it at that. He put a few things in there to protect Job. He put restrictions on Satan. Satan wasn't given free rein to do whatever he wanted. God was restraining him a little bit. He allowed the attack to come, but with restraints. Why? Because God was protecting Job. With my kids, I'm their dad, and I am a protected dad. I'm no parenting expert by any means, but I've figured out I can't protect my kids from everything. More than that, I think I figured out I shouldn't protect my kids from everything. Especially as they get older. It's just not going to be possible to protect my children from every bad thing that this world is going to throw at them. My parents did what I think is a great job of protecting me, but there came a point that I got a job, and I know this from talking to my dad, that when I came home and told him about the things that my coworkers were doing or were saying to me or had done, that he wanted to protect me. I know there were days that he told me he wanted to go and punch the lights out of people that I worked with, but couldn't. I appreciate my parents very much. My dad is a very protective dad, but there came a point when I turned 18 that my dad told me, "You're an adult, you're going to have to do what you do. I'll be here to help you when you ask," but he hasn't forced protecting from that point. That has helped me understand as my kids get older, that becomes more and more the case, that I won't be able to protect from everything. So because of that, I now will try to occasionally let them deal with things that are somewhat hard, to prepare them for the fact that life is hard. But the things that I let them face are always within boundaries that I can step in if needed. I learned that from my parents. My parents strongly encouraged my brother and I to get jobs while we were teens, and I didn't know this at the time, I found out when I was a little bit older. Their reason was they knew we would face things in our jobs that would try to pull us from God, and they wanted us to face those while we were still under their influence enough that they could help guide us back. They could help lead through that, as opposed to many who want their kids to wait until they graduate. The kid's exposed to all that, and the parent has zero control. It's a form of protecting. That's what God is doing. That's what this is. He allows this to come with his boundaries. God's protecting Job with the boundaries that he places. Who's also protecting Job by simply watching his struggles, by paying attention. God didn't say, this is going to be hard for Job, so I need to turn the other way. I can't look. I like Job. We have a relationship, and Satan's going to attack, so I can't walk. I'm going to cover my eyes. No, he kept on. He stayed engaged. And we know that because later on in the book, when he and Job are talking, like I mentioned earlier, God rehearses back to Job what happened. Meaning he was there. He was watching. He was paying attention. Things were bad. Satan was attacking. There's no denying any of that. But God hadn't abandoned Job. He was still taking care of him. He was still protecting him. He had allowed Satan inside that hedge of protection, but within God's parameters, and he was keeping an eye out. Now, have you ever thought of the fact that when you are under attack, God is still working to protect you? When we're under attack, God is still there working to protect us. And I think about the verse 1 Corinthians 10:13. Have no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. Meaning that when I go through temptations, God is controlling the temptation. He won't let you have more than you can handle. He gives a way out. That's God is still there. You can see God in the worst day possible in Job's life, in that he knew Job and that he was protecting Job. We can see God even in this day in that he came to Job. Now I'm going to have us turn really quickly to a handful of verses. Turn to Job 38, verse 1, just to give us this idea that he came to Job. Job 38, verse 1 says, let's try that again. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, I'm going to stop there, skip down to 40 and verse 1. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, 40 and 3. Then Job answered the Lord and said, and it goes on from there, verse 40 and verse 6. Then answered the Lord unto Job out of the whirlwind and said, chapter 42 and verse 1. Then Job answered the Lord and said, Job has gone through all of this trial. He's now faced that and lost everything. He's now past where his wife tells him, why don't you just curse God and die? Let him just strike you dead. You know, God love a wife that'll build you up and support you through your struggles like Job's wife here. He's past his supposed friends coming and just laying into him, tearing him down. He's cried out to God, in essence, wanting answers, wanting to know why. And I'm not going to this evening really go into all of that, but what I want us to focus on is simply that when he cries out to God, God answered. Over and over, we can read through from chapter 38 through 42, we can see over and over, the Lord said to Job, the Lord said to Job, the Lord said to Job. Job cried out to God, the Lord said to Job. Over and over again. God didn't leave Job alone and in despair. He came to him. He came to him, and in that, helped Job in a couple of ways. He reminded Job who he was. He reminded Job who he was. All of chapter 38, let's see Job's reaction to chapter 40, verses 3 through 5. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay mine hand upon my mouth. Once have I spoken, but I will not answer. Yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. Here's what God does. All through chapter 38 and 39, God reminds Job that he's nothing. Which doesn't sound too nice. I mean, it really doesn't. You hear that and man, that's rough. I mean, Job has just gone through all this, and God comes to him and tells him, hey, Job, you're nothing. That's what it is. He tells Job, you know, I created the stars and all of this. Were you there? Nope, didn't think so. I did this. Do you know how that works? Nope, didn't think so. I mean, just over and over, you're nothing. You know, you've just gone through the ringer, and God comes to you and helps by reminding you you're worthless. But that's a reminder we all need. Because we tend to think really highly of us. We put ourselves on a pedestal and start to think, well, I'm something, especially if God's blessed us. I'm something, and every once in a while, we need to be knocked down a little bit. So God reminds Job of who he is, but then, more importantly, I think, God reminds Job of who God is. Chapter 40, verses 6 through 9, then answered the Lord unto Job out of the whirlwind and said, Gird up thy loins now like a man, I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me, wilt thou disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me that thou mayest be righteous? Hast thou an arm like God, or canst thou thunder with a voice like him? Goes on from there, reminding Job of his power, of who God is. And this, again, is something we tend to often forget, just how powerful God really is. Because we see our problems, and we see how big our problems are. We see the trial that we're going through and how huge that looks to us. We see all these other things going on. We see how big they are. And somehow in that we miss how much bigger than all that God is. Our world right now has all these crazy things going on. The virus and the riots and the everything else seems like it would be an incredibly long list to try to figure them all out. It feels like every day there is something else crazy going on. I thought yesterday my wife and I were going to witness something crazy going on. There was, all of this, like anger against police officers. We're driving down the road, and there's a Tacoma police officer going down the road, and there were two bikers. The officer was in front of us. Bikers were like 3 cars behind us, and they sped in the wrong lanes to get behind him, and then very erratically switching lanes to stay right behind him. I followed them for a while, telling her I think they're going to wind up doing something. I was thinking I was going to be jumping out of my truck and backing up an officer or something. I don't know. It was crazy because it just seems like our world right now, that wouldn't shock you. Every day it seems like there's this new crazy thing that happens, and it's really easy to see all of these crazy things happening and think, wow, they're so big. This is such a huge problem, and forget that my God is bigger. Every now and then we need to take a step back and remember who God is. You know what the problem is? The problem is that what we are closest to looks the biggest. The problem is what we are closest to looks the biggest. Can I use you as an example for a moment? It's a good example. You're going to be God for a moment. Stand up. Sorry, I guess I've got to. Okay, Caleb. Stand up. Caleb is a big, strong guy. Big enough that I can stand here with this mic and have no problem. He's tall enough, his hand as he's leading, whacked that mic at least 2 times during the song. I mean, he is a big, strong guy. But check this out. If I hold my thumb up, I can't see Caleb. My thumb completely blocks Caleb out, which obviously means my thumb is bigger and stronger than he is. Right? No, it's perception. It's perceived that way because my thumb is right here, and he's way over there. But if I walk closer to Caleb, my thumb no longer looks bigger than him. And oftentimes we see our trials as bigger than God because our relationship with God is or we are closer to our trials than we are close to God. You go ahead and sit down. Thank you. We've allowed ourselves to get so close to the problems that they appear to us to be bigger than God is capable of handling. The solution to that is pretty simple. Just like the solution to my thumb being bigger than Brother Caleb was simple. I got closer to him. Get closer to God, go closer to him, and you'll see that the problem isn't so big after all. It's what God is doing for Job here, reminding him, hey, your problems look big, and I know you face these things. He reminded Job, I know you face these things, but remember just how big I am. He came to Job. He reminded him who he is. He reminded him who God is. It's, again, a comforting thought to know that when I am in my worst day imaginable, God comes to me, that he hears my prayer, and better yet, he answers me. You can see God through all this. God knew Job. God was protecting Job. He came to him, and then lastly this evening, God rewarded Job. We see that in Job chapter 42, verses 12, starting verse 12, if I can find my place there. Let's go. Starting verse 12. So the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning. For he had 14,000 sheep and 6,000 camels and 1,000 yoke of oxen and 1,000 she-asses. He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he called the name of the first gentleman. I'm actually not going to go into reading all of it right now. You skip down to verse 15. And in all the land were no women found so fair as the daughters of Job, and their father gave them inheritance among their brethren. After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' sons, even 4 generations. So Job died, being old and full of days. Job's gone through all this and stayed faithful. But through it all, he never turns from God. He never does as his wife suggests and just curse God and die. Through it all, he stayed faithful to God, and through it all, God was with him. And in the end, God rewarded him. If you do the math, with what Job had before to what God gave him in the end, it is double. He blessed him. Now follow me on this. We should never follow God thinking, well, I'm doing this so that God will bless me. We should not, for instance, give money to the church simply because, well, we know the Bible says that it will return tenfold. So if I give my money, God better multiply it back to me. We shouldn't follow Him simply for the reason that we want Him to bless our lives. But at the same point, it's good to know that God will supply all my needs.
Amen. Yeah.
That if I stay faithful to Him, that it doesn't go unnoticed. God didn't have to bless Job in his, in his latter end. It's nowhere is it required of God to have done that. But it didn't go unnoticed. It's a comforting thing to know that if I stay faithful to Him, it does not go unnoticed. That might not mean that I get riches here on earth. It might not mean, that if I surrender my life to God, He gives me double what I had before. But it does mean that God's going to provide for me. All through this ordeal that Job faced, we can see evidence all throughout it that God was there, right beside Job, through all of it. Which tells me I can know that no matter what I'm facing in life, God's there. He knows me. He's protecting me. He'll come to me. And I'll be better for it when it's through. As I prepared for this message, song kept coming to my mind, Because He Lives. Because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. Because I know He holds the future, and life is worth the living just because He lives. The song goes on to say, I can face uncertain days because He lives. Bad days are going to come. Unfortunately, life can't be all sunshine and lollipops. Bad days come. But they aren't so bad when we remember that God is there. The bad days don't seem so bad. The problems don't seem so huge when I remember God is there and keep my relationship with Him where it ought to be.